Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. I just have to share I don't know if you can see my screen. Let me hold on. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
All right, thank you. All right, so I will begin. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's a pleasure. Um, so today I want to talk about cultivating a response against racism and promoting the well-being of youth of color. Okay. Moving next. These are just my disclosures. I don't have any financial relationships to disclose with anything related to this presentation. And what I want to be able to cover today is defining racism, including structural racism, discrimination, and anti-racism, and really how does that impact children and youth? Identify protective and risk factors which can influence the impact of racism on child and adolescent mental health, and consider some current issues around mental health and suicide statistics, unfortunately for Black children. But importantly, I want to make sure that we end in thinking about how do we cultivate a response against the impact of racism and promote the well-being of youth of color. So I want to start with a composite vignette. Derek is a Black young man who has lived his whole life in a city. Growing up, Derek hated school. Whenever trouble occurred, teachers usually assumed he was responsible for the problem. Derek felt treated as though he was not expected to do well, unlike other children, and he eventually believed he was not as smart as the other students and began to feel out of place in school. In his early teens, Derek started avoiding school and was truant, which resulted in him being expelled, and his white peers were given warnings for similar infractions. And to fill his days, Derek spent much time on the streets of his city. At about the time he turned 17, he experimented with cannabis or marijuana. And shortly after, he started hearing voices and was diagnosed with a drug-induced psychosis and then with schizophrenia and was committed to a psychiatric unit. Derek resented being in the hospital, which he realized had a large number of other Black young men. Many of them had entered into mental health services following the involvement of the police. Many of them were in therapy many of them did not receive therapy actually, and were given the chance to talk about their lived experience. And when racism was broached, when that came up as a topic, staff often changed the subject or became angry or at least uncomfortable. And Derek tried to tolerate racial slurs on the ward, mainly from other mental health service users. Derek remained in the hospital for a month, and weeks after his discharge, he got into a confrontation with the police. He claimed to have been stopped by police 3 times in the same day, and he also reported to have been stopped the day before. Derek had recurrently seen police officers target Black children for searches or young people, and he became defiant, angry, and refused to comply. And the situation escalated on one event. And Derek ended up being restrained by 3 officers, and he was arrested, and he was charged with assault. And in court, no one seemed interested in his experience with the police or with schools. Instead, he was deemed to have a problem with authority and sentenced to 6 months in prison, where he became psychologically unwell again. And there he was transferred to a secure unit where he was detained for several years. So Derek's story is a description of not just how race can have an impact on the well-being of young people and their mental health, but also the concept of race and racism. And we'll talk about different levels of that, and including structural racism in a moment. But when we just even think about race, we know it's a social construct. It's a concept which signifies and symbolizes underlying social conflicts and interests that we have in our society that really refers to how different types of human bodies, different people of different colors and brown and black or indigenous are symbolized as less. And racism, therefore, is a belief that race is a primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. And we can see how that systematically was occurring in the vignette of Derek, where he had different treatment and different outcomes for similar struggles that maybe some of his non African American or Black peers also may have encountered. He paid a lot more for his mistakes or challenges. Discrimination, um, we often hear this terminology, and what we're really talking about is unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people or things, especially on the grounds of race, age, and sex. And then what is inequity then? Is really a lack of fairness or justice or bias within systems and practices that relate to discrimination and racism. And may include prejudice, which is, unjustified, or usually includes prejudice, which is an unjustified or incorrect attitude towards an individual based solely on their membership of a social group, which could be race or ethnicity or other characteristics or groups. And in my research, what I have found is that, young people do experience everyday discrimination. And this was a study that we did a while back, but I would imagine that there is still very similar outcomes. But this was a study of Latino and Asian American and African American youth. And we focused here on the Latino population. This was a nationally representative database. And what we found in questioning the epidemiological sample, what was their rate of everyday discrimination in terms of discrimination around their race or ethnicity or their language. It was much, much more prevalent around the younger population, as you can see here, which is age 18 to 24. This was an adult sample, but it was the younger population within that adult sample that was really aware and sensitive to this idea of discrimination, and less so in the older generations. And we can imagine that because young people are the ones that are, especially when we're thinking about Latino and immigrant populations, that they are interacting with society and experiencing these experiences of racism and discrimination within school and within work and within society where they're interacting. Um, but what we also found was in research that we have done, that I have done with colleagues, as well as what we see here with Schmier, is that discrimination is a contributor to racial disparities in health and also stress related psychological and physiological changes in children and adolescents. And from a physiological perspective, what's actually been found is that racial ethnic differences are found in terms of what we call low grade inflammation, which is really levels of stress hormones like cortisol that are elevated, even if so slightly, but yet impacting physical and mental health. And that risk for elevated, again, what we call inflammation or stress hormone levels are higher for Hispanic and African American or Black children, and also children with foreign born parents compared to children of the same race ethnicity with US born parents in regards to the immigrant population. So there is something probably multifactorial in the sense of experiencing discrimination in race and also the structural implications that has in regards to poverty and social position that impact directly even physiological states of stress for young people. And we've seen this in adult samples and populations where we know this very phenomenon of inflammation is related to heart disease, and high blood pressure and diabetes, and elevated rates of that in Black and other communities of color in the United States. And we know that, the social environment is very critical for these outcomes. A large body of research identifies the critical role of early life social contexts, such as a child's school, neighborhoods, and households, in shaping their trajectory and their health. And recent scholarship argues that some school environments are so stressful, maybe, for example, one similar to what we saw in Derek's story. They're so stressful due to high levels of violence, disorder, and poverty, and perhaps also even we can put in here discrimination, that they may be toxic to children and result in these physiological changes that have a direct impact on psychology and physical health. And so we need to be able to, as I'll talk about towards the end of this presentation, focus also on strengths and culturally adaptive resources that can help children not have to encounter these toxic stress. And the other thing we have to think about is that racism is a system. It is not an individual character flaw, nor a personal moral failing, nor a psychiatric illness. It's a system. It consists of structures, policies, practices, and norms that structures opportunities and assigns value based on phenotype, what people look like, their color of their skin, or the way people look. And it does unfairly disadvantage some individuals and communities, and therefore disadvantages certain children. And the system of racism undermines the realization. And this is where I think it's really just to sort of underline this statement of why it's so critical when we think about child development and their outcomes. The system of racism essentially undermines realization of the full potential of a whole society because of the waste of human resources and lives, right? And when we think about children as our future, our present, are critical to our society, it undermines their full realization based on race. And we know that it also contributed in the current situation that we are to the disproportionate impact of the pandemic, which is one example of how these underlying structures can impact health directly. And we've seen that, unfortunately, in our current time. So I'm going to try to sort of present the next slide as a video of a young man, Ellis, who at the time of this was in 8th grade, where he's talking about his own experience of being a Black young man and toxic situations in his life, and his thoughts about that. I have one more before that. Anti-racism, we're going to be talking about that, which is really work that Kendi has put forward, and many people may have seen his books. The opposite of racist is not racist, it's anti-racist. And it's really how do we put together powerful collections of anti-racist policies and practices that can lead us to racial equity, and that we can substantiate that, all of us, as being anti-racist versus racist, or in terms of supporting racist policy, which I don't think any of us want to do intentionally. But what Kenzie sort of pushes us to be aware of is that we actually have to not just be neutral, but actually proactively work against policies and systems that impact negatively on communities, including children.
This is a dedication. Imagine you're at the dinner table with your parents. It's a normal weekday, just like the others. You're having a normal conversation with your parents, and mid-flow between the conversation, you hear breaking news, and a man had been shot for no particular reason. Your now scared parents begin telling you about safety with the police. Imagine this scene. Your parents begin to explain the situation, with one acting as the police and the other telling you to just be calm and do as the officers say. With one hand held high, you say, "I'm just reaching for my wallet." This scene seems unnecessary, but it is exactly what happens in my family, simply because we are black. Do you think this is fair? Because I don't. So far in America, there has been a great number of black people who are wrongfully killed by police officers. To be specific, there has been 722 fatal killings, and 3/4 of them were black. This statistic is ridiculous because black people only make up 13% of the population, but are 5 times as more likely to get stopped by the police. Black Lives Matter was introduced when a series of racially motivated killings started to happen in America. It is an international activist movement that originated in the African American community. Black Lives Matter campaigns against the violence and perceived racism of black people. It also supports the black families who have been impacted by the wrongful killings from police officers. Did you know that black suspects are more likely to get wrongfully shot for supposedly having a weapon? A recent shooting was in 2016 when a man named Anton Sterling was outside selling CDs outside of a convenience store. Just an innocent man selling CDs did not deserve this. Only a day after, another man named Philando Castile was in his car when he was fatally shot by police officers for carrying a pistol, even though he was licensed. These are just only 2 of the stories. There are even more innocent deaths like Keith Lammett Scott, Roy Richards, Jason King, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, and Trayvon Martin. This makes me feel agitated because I know too that I'm at risk of this, and this still goes on in my hometown. In addition, it highlights because I'm black, I have to take into extra consideration everything I do, potentially more than any other race. For example, I have to take into account the impact of being black could have on my future. When I apply for a job, for example, there is no room for error. People could disregard me solely because of the color of my skin. Because I'm black, I have to make sure that my qualifications undeniably open the door that the color of my skin might want to close. Imagine a man named Connor and another man named Jamal both applied for the same job. Who do you think is more likely to get the job? Connor is more likely to get the job because they'll look at the 2 names and immediately recognize that Jamal is the stereotypical black name. This also makes me feel worried and furious, not only for myself, but for my dad, grandpa, and uncle, because they are all black and they could all potentially get stopped by the police for even walking home. I don't like to hear stories where anybody gets shot. In particular, I like to hear stories where black people get shot from police officers for no particular reason. I was victimized in my previous school because of the color of my skin, and that didn't make me feel good, and it shouldn't make you feel good either. Say if someone said to you, "Are you carrying a gun?" just because of the color of your skin color. Why does being black not make you even to everyone else? The Black Lives Matter movement is necessary because it wants equal rights, and that's the message they're protesting for. Black Lives Matter is protesting for equality in the long run by focusing on Black Lives Matter now. People can argue that all lives matter, in which they do, but all lives matter can't matter until brown lives, black lives, Asian lives, European lives, all lives matter equally. I'm going to put a cartoon on screen to furthermore explain my point. First of all, anyone, black, white, brown, or any other types of people can spread awareness. They can tell their friends why Black Lives Matter. However, protesting isn't always the way to succeed in your claim. Last but not least, black people should be more calm and make websites, make YouTube videos explaining why Black Lives Matter, or even making pamphlets. We can all unite to prevent the killings of black people. This is a dedication to Anton Sterling, Philando Castile, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, and Trayvon Martin. There's simply not enough roses to represent the innocent black people killed by white police officers. This is why Black Lives Matter now. Black Lives Matter, and my life matters. Thank you.
Hi, so can everybody hear me? Sorry that I'm having a little bit of technology difficulty, but um, I don't know if we want to continue with the slides from over there just to make sure, because I'm having some technology issues here. So, so the integrative model of minority youth development. So this is one of the things that I want to focus on in thinking about the rest of the presentation. So one of the things, this is a model that was created by Garcia Cole quite a while ago, but has been used a lot in research, including research that I have been doing, and really looking at how does different aspects of racism, prejudice, discrimination, oppression impact minority youth development. And we've already been talking about the impact of race and racism. But the other thing to understand is that there are also environmental and social and familial factors that can impact on the outcomes of discrimination and other stressors, including things that are adaptive in terms of family support, racial socialization, acculturation that is adaptive, communities that also promote um, good development and mental health, which could be schools that are responsive to those issues of including responsive to trauma and disparities. So neighborhoods, families, other social constructs can actually be very protective and versus being a risk factor, which we'll talk a little bit about. Okay, next. I think you want to advance that. So school environments, some of the ways that that has an impact, and by the way, I'm going to have articles that people can have and see on their slides to refer to with more depth. But obviously, school environments can serve as early life stressors in the lives of young people, like we saw in the vignette of Derek. School socioeconomic composition, and stressors can be associated with those physiological changes that we talked about earlier, including dysregulation, that can continue into young adulthood. Next. So, and we see this a bit in some of the structural factors that we were talking about, discrimination, structural racism, where a disproportionate number of African-American children can receive more than are more likely to receive school suspensions, even in preschool. And in kindergarten through grade 12, African-American children are suspended 3 times more and expelled 1.9 times more than their white peers. And there's, and what we know also, again, always balancing this, is that strong racial ethnic identity and parental engagement in and families engaged in schools and children engaged in their families can actually be very protective against the negative impacts of these potentially structural issues. Next. So across multiple measures of physiological functioning and psychological well-being, the social and structural characteristics of schools play an essential role in shaping the health of adolescents through adulthood, but also after students leave school, because if they, especially if they leave early, if they drop out, which we'll talk about, that can lead to ongoing health consequences. Next. And so what am I talking about here is that we know that disparities in educational access and attainment, along with racism experience in schools, um, obviously affects, again, the trajectory of academic achievement for children, which will ultimately impact their socioeconomic status and health. Chronic absenteeism disproportionately affects children of color, maybe in some of the ways that we saw in Derek's vignette, and children living in poverty with disabilities or with chronic diseases also are disproportionately absent. And in high school, we see that there are racial ethnic differences in terms of absenteeism based on race, with Hispanic and African American and American Indian children having higher rates of chronic absenteeism as compared to white children. Next. And then we know that, again, here are some of the structural societal issues that impact, which include immigration enforcement, um, having an impact on children, Latinx, and certain Black immigrant populations not attending school as regularly. And we see that there is an impact also on graduation rates, where there are lower graduation rates for African American, American Indian, Hispanic students as compared to white nationally, and that has been an ongoing trend. And so these disparities in graduation absenteeism, again, go back to the statement that I made about having a negative impact on the realization and full benefits of educational attainment, and can result in development of chronic disease, and actually has been found to reduce overall life expectancy. Okay, next. And then the other issue, we've been thinking a lot about separations in terms of an immigration issue, but we also know that Black children make up nearly half of the foster care population, which is another type of separation, although they constitute less than 1/5 of the nation's children. So there's, again, in the child welfare system, a disproportionate impact. And once removed from their homes, Black children tend to remain in foster care longer, are moved more often, and receive fewer services, and are less likely to be returned home or adopted. So there's a disproportionate impact of not having permanency and security. Next. And the prison system is yet another aspect of separation, where when we look at minor children in the US, and this is sort of a little bit of older data, but it has been unfortunately persistent, where African American youth, and that's what was at the far right bar, 6.7% of children with parents in prison, as compared to Latinx, and which is the next larger red, or Native American, Native American, and then white. Next. So experiences of discrimination significantly associated with lifetime and 12-month major depression, and 12-month anxiety in African American Caribbean youth. And this is what this study has found. It has a direct impact on mental health. And a study that we are currently completing, which is looking at Puerto Rican youth living in the South Bronx, as compared to Puerto Rican youth living in Puerto Rico. And this is a study where we're using that model of child development to see how the environmental factors can impact on mental health. And given exposure to traumatic experiences, Puerto Rican youth living in the South Bronx have higher PTSD symptoms than those living in Puerto Rico. And we think that it does have to do with social position and experiences of being a minoritized young person. And even within that data set, even when we look at multiple adversities, discrimination in its own right, independently, is associated with increased post-traumatic symptoms as compared to when youth do not experience as much discrimination. Next. We also know that Black youth um, uh, and African American boys in particular, as compared to girls, are frequently targets for racial discrimination as they get older. And unfortunately, I've even seen this in my son, that when he was younger and cute, um, he didn't experience as much. And as he started to become a young man, he started to experience very direct racial discrimination, even racial slurs, to be honest. And that was very shocking for him, and he didn't know what happened. And it's a very challenging thing for young people and families as they increasingly experience that discrimination, and that in itself is related to increased depression symptoms, but also externalizing sort of behavioral problems that are associated with perceived racial discrimination and impact on youth behavior. Next. Um, and then the other thing that we know is that with segregation, when certain communities are segregated by race, there tends to be a concentration of poverty with high levels of neighborhood disadvantage, low quality housing, things that become cumulative risk factors um, for um, for mental health concerns, as well as physical health problems. There's often a co-occurrence of social problems. Segregated geographic areas have more physical and chemical hazards, and less resources that enhance health. So segregation is a structural way that also impacts on child well-being. Next. And then one of the things that I want to focus and make sure that we get to in the time that we have is this very concerning issue about the rate of suicide among Black youth, which has doubled in the last 20 years. It's the third leading cause of death for Black Americans ages 15 to 24. And this is an AMA statistic. Next. And this graph sort of looks at between 1991 and 2017, where the blue line, the top one, which are Black teenagers versus white teenagers, the green line, you can see the difference in rates of suicide, where in 1991 you had 6.9% for white teens and 5.9% for Black teens. But as you can see, as time has gone over, Black teens have increased their rates of suicide much more than white teens. Next. And a very concerning issue is if we zoom in during that time for children 5 to 11 years in the US, Black youth are even sort of the difference is stark in terms of 2.5 rate in Black youth as compared to white of suicide rates per 1 million. So the rate is, twice in this for Black children in this 5 to 11 year age range, which is very concerning. And people are trying to figure out, what exactly is there. And so if we go to the next slide, this particular study looked at age-related racial disparities in suicide, and what they found, it's difficult to really understand what the potential mechanisms um, and what has resulted in this racial difference. But ongoing surveillance efforts are really needed to look at what's the association between that interaction essentially between race and age, risk for youth suicide, which, when we look at specific cases, there seems to be some combination of being bullied, racism, discrimination, and mental health concerns that are either pre-existing or related to those constellation of challenges that seem to place younger Black youth at increased risk. So it goes back again to sort of the very profound effect that these multiple factors can have on youth. Next. And then the other thing that we have to think about, which we have in the current environment, is what are young people being exposed to and online, and the situations that they're seeing. And this particular study looked at race-related traumatic events being presented online and in social media. And what they found was that among African American and Latinx adolescents, 11 to 19 years old, exposure to online events like looking at shootings or deaths or violent acts against people of color is related to depressive symptoms, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, and that was with a multiple regression sort of controlling for many variables. Next. So there was that significant association. And if they had more frequent exposure to traumatic events online, it was associated with higher levels of PTSD. So definitely a relationship there. Girls reported more so this relationship. And again, Latinx participants also reported the increased depressive symptoms. Next. So, so this really comes to this question about what is the real impact for Black American children, especially boys. And this particular study by Jackson et al. Looked at the role of religiosity for mental health. So here I want to start ending towards thinking about what are some things that might be protective. Next. And what this study found was that Black American adolescent boys with who reported religiosity were that was associated with lower depressive symptoms, even when looking at these negative uh, situations for Black youth that they can see. It did, seeing this did make them feel like police abuse was associated with lower public regard for Blacks and Black young people. But the religiosity helped sort of prevent the development of depression, even with that realization. Next. And numerous studies have found that religious social support um, uh, buffers, I guess is the best word, around the experience of discrimination and developing a psychiatric disorder like depression. Those who, young people who, especially African American youth who experience religious social support are less likely to have a psychiatric disorder. And that goes back to the model that I showed you about development, where there are things that in the environment that can promote and support well-being, even in the context of these potentially very toxic situations of discrimination and racism. Next. So what we really want to think about is the way to work on this is really looking at socialization, racial socialization, and supporting development. And what the research that I have done and others have done has shown that family support, religiosity, racial socialization, and managing discrimination, even what we saw in the video of the young man's family trying to prepare him for this, even though it's very challenging. If it can support sort of also a positive racial ethnic affiliation and identity formation, and even biculturalism for, say, immigrant populations, that all of those things can be protective against the negative effects of discrimination and racism. Next. So how do we address the problem? It's important for us to understand how all of these issues of discrimination and structural racism impact children and adolescents. Look at inequities and disparities and injustices as things that are part of the targeted things that we need to work on, and support the mental health and development of minoritized youth through this approach. One of the things that I have found in research and in my clinical practice is that belonging is very important in terms of identity formation and well-being, and social support is. And that's been replicated across many studies and many contexts. Next. So it's important to identify the community strengths which protect youth in this way, like religiosity and social support. And as the late James Jackson, who helped develop the everyday discrimination scale that we've been talking about, is given the structural impediments that they face, why do Black people do so well sometimes? And it is because of these other protective factors that can be present in the community. Next. So we need to think about these mental health promoting environments in our families, family support systems that we do to help support families, schools. How do we build environments that are supportive of identity and actively work in anti-racist ways? Supporting neighborhoods around resources. How do we think about these structures in our healthcare and in our communities is very important. Next. And really the way we need to think about this is creating that middle ground there, which is resilience in terms of promoting community connectedness, the availability of resources that are prevention, not just mental health services, thinking about our school systems and actively engaging in conversations and processes that improve the impact, cultivating mental health, promoting and trauma-informed environments. Next. And this is the way that we create these trauma-informed care, which is to realize the impact of trauma. And I would put in here the impact of racism and discrimination. Recognize the signs and symptoms of that trauma in clients, families, children in our schools, and integrating knowledge of to respond, to integrate knowledge about trauma and policies in our practices, and then resist re-traumatization. Next. And then towards the end of this, and I want to end soon, so we have like a couple of minutes for questions, hopefully, but our Marshall Plan for Children's Mental Health is a resource that we can look at that was recently put up by Hogwood and Keller, where it's basically saying that, across race, if we're going to build better, especially after this pandemic, we have to put children first in all of our systems of care and schools and communities. Allow families and communities to drive the agenda of recovery, recovery that promotes fairness and is anti-racist, I would add to this. Continue to have valid and reliable data to monitor improvements in our systems. And then I would say in terms of mental health services in schools, financial flexibility to support innovative solutions that we can work together across mental health and schools in creating these sort of trauma-informed and anti-racist systems of care. Next. So I'm just going to end here with two quotes that I hope sort of motivate us in terms of what we need to do, which is the ultimate measure of a person, Martin Luther King said, is not where one stands in moments of comfort, but where one stands in times of challenge and controversy. And I think we're definitely in a place and time now that we need to think about it from this perspective. And then the last slide, which is basically Michelle Obama's, that so many of us grow up learning about these things, Black, white, everyone, no matter how well-meaning we think we might be, to do the honest, uncomfortable work of rooting racism out is where we're going to make change. So I'll end there so that we have at least a couple of minutes to be able to maybe have a question or two.
Thanks so much, Dr. Fortuna. That was a great overview of some of the things that we need to consider and how we need to take steps forward. We do have a couple of questions. The first one asks for recommendations for how to address race and health disparities on a system level, or steps a clinic could take to reach children at higher risk. And how do we expand the diversity of our patients seeking care? That's all part of the question.
Yeah. So how do we do that? I mean, one of the things that I think is really important, which we haven't done enough of, is one of the things I wrote in the slide is working with communities. Some of the things that we're doing here, for example, in healthcare, is having community advisory boards that are not just after the fact, telling us, how we're doing, actually involved in the design of our clinical services, from everything from what do our services look like, which might be sort of more surface changes in terms of how representative the place looks, right, of sort of culture and context and who's there, but also having very clear advisors about what are their priorities. Like, for example, here in the Bayview, environmental health is a big concern because there's been some toxicity in the local community, and actually the water. And so the community said, we want mental health, but we also want people who know about environmental health and how to protect our health, given that we've had this toxicity put in our water in our community. And so as we prioritize what the community wants and they drive, then there's more uh, acceptance, right, of sort of a communication around mental health services, because you're also addressing the core needs that the community identifies. That partnership, I think, is critical for improving, and then also increasing the pipeline, which I know we're having challenges about. Pipeline of multiculturally represented providers, even. And we're doing that. We're actually starting with high school students and introducing them to mental health, and having them work with us so that they could consider being in a mental health or healthcare field.
The second question was regarding any resources where there is an integrative community approach to addressing racism in children. Any resources that, and you were talking about that to some extent, but any additional?
Yeah, so I could send this forward maybe, but one thing that's really good is the Hearts program. And that's something that we're doing. Joyce Dorado, Drado, is doing an trauma-informed anti-racism curriculum in schools. And we're doing it from the hospital. So it has this approach of sort of trauma-informed mental health, but also but she works directly with schools around looking at these very issues, right? How does discrimination, disparities, bias impact children? How do we create anti-racist, focused, and trauma-informed schools where children can heal, and we can up, like we said, the promoting environments for children's well-being.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a great presentation. We so appreciate your taking the time to join with us today. And even with our...
Thank you. And sorry for a little bit of technology.
Not a problem. Thanks again.
All right.
And we will take a short break and rejoin at 11:10. Thank you.